I'm going to introduce the session. So anyone that is recording, you can turn on your recording device now. Okay, so the title of this session is the Holistic Teachers Panel on Meditative Inquiry. Meditative Inquiry. Each speaker will be given 12 minutes, by the way, and I'll give you a 3-minute warning. The first presenter is Alexandra Barclay. Alexandra Barclay is a doctoral student at Mount St. Vincent University and a teacher at the South Shore Regional Center for Education, who tries to incorporate inquiry, dialogue, and eco-literacy in her classes to engage students in exploring the problems facing the planet. The title for her talk today is Holistic Teaching with a French Twist. Dawn Erley will be the next up. She is a new presenter interested in deploying a teaching methodology that seeks to subvert the imperialist, white supremacist heteropatriarchy and is deeply fascinated by dialogical meditative inquiry. The title of her talk today is Dialogical Meditative Inquiry in the English Classroom. Carolyn Prest will be up next. Carolyn Prest is a teacher in rural Nova Scotia with a passion for the visual arts and in epistemological and metaphysical studies. She is particularly interested in how we can find ourselves through experiences with and in nature, and how such experiences can be integrated into mainstream curricula. The title of her talk today is 21 Pillars, Promoting Meditative Inquiry in the Public School Classroom. The fourth speaker will be Yelena Smith, who is a history teacher at Charles P. Allen High School and has been teaching world history and French since 1995 in Russia, USA, and Canada. She is currently pursuing a master's in Foundations of Education degree at MSVU. The title of her talk today is Crocheting the Sacred Threads of Indigenous and Holistic Knowledges in History Classes. The final presenter is Jack Ward. Jack Ward is a high school English teacher who is taking a master's to teach English as a second or additional language as a circuit teacher for the Halifax Regional Center for Education. He is currently restructuring his English classroom using holistic and meditative approaches. The title of his talk today is Practical Applications in a High School English Classroom. And so to begin, Ali Barclay is going to lead a meditation for us all. So I'll lead it to you, Ali.
Perfect. Thank you, Bonnie. So I chose a meditation today that I enjoy personally, and usually I would do this before a yoga class. And I just tried to make it a little sort of more condensed, just so we can have a bit more time afterwards. Yeah, so I'll begin. Feel free to shut off your cameras if that gives you more space to relax. So firstly, I'll just invite everybody to bring their drishti or their gaze inward by closing their eyes, or if you prefer just gazing down at the floor, that's equally nice to relax the mind and relax your eyes. See if you can uncross your legs and potentially just put your hands in your lap. And I'll get everybody to take a big breath in through the nose and see if you can count to 3. And then exhale through the nose to a count of 4. 3, 2, 1. Again, inhale softness for 3, 2, 1. And again, exhale ease for 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, breathing in calm for 3, 2, 1. And exhale ease for 4, 3, 2, 1. Again, breathe in through the nose for 3, 2, 1. And again, we're going to exhale through the nose for 4, 3, 2, and 1. Continue this breath through the nose if that's accessible to you. And now I'll just invite you to imagine a white light over your head as you breathe this light, think of it entering through the crown chakra, the top of the head. Continue to breathe and let this beautiful white light fill your head, reaching your Ajna chakra, the third eye, passing down over your neck and Vishuddha, your throat chakra. And let this light cover your shoulders and chest, flowing to Anahata, your heart chakra. Let your face soften, tongue behind your teeth, and let your shoulders move back and down. With your next breath in, let this white light flow down towards your solar plexus chakra and your belly button, inviting your belly to be soft. Continue letting this white light flow down over your hips and your sacral chakra, our center of creativity. With your next breath, imagine this white light at the base of the spine, connecting you, rooting you to your Muladhara. Let this flow down towards the earth. Sit with this feeling just for a few more breaths. And let's maybe take one more deep inhale through the nose. And exhale, ease. And when you're ready, just come back into your space and back into your room and back into our shared collective space.
Thank you so much for that. It's a wonderful start to the session. And now, Ali, as you're the first presenter, I'll just leave it with you and you can take it from here. And I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Okay, I'll try and keep an eye on my time as well. So I don't have presentation to share. I was hoping to sort of speak and try and be slightly improvised just to leave room for that sort of creativity. But I thought I would start with a quote from a French novelist, philosopher, Voltaire. And he says at the end of his book, Candide, en français, il faut cultiver notre jardin. I love this quote and I'll explain why, but this novel has sort of been coming back to me in so many ways through the years. It is definitely a Eurocentric novel. It's a French text written in 1759. But I think some of the themes that are in this work are so important and really speak to what so many of the presenters have spoken around throughout the last couple days and also today. But just to give a little background to myself first, getting into why I just chose that quote, but I'm coming to you from Liverpool, Nova Scotia. I teach French for the SSRCE here on the South Shore. And obviously I'm in Mi'kmaq territory, so I just wanted to recognize that fact also, and that we are on unceded territory, and that we are bound in peace and friendship. I'll just add too that, you know, obviously teaching French is sort of a settler language, and so I'm very conscious of that too. And I definitely try and sort of make my students aware that we are learning French in school, you know, as a language acquisition course, definitely because of our history, our colonial history that is particularly violent. So I just wanted to share that's something that I'm committed to speaking around in class, and I do try and think of ways to incorporate why language and identity is so important to people. So I'm definitely on a journey and continuing to do that. So I just thought I'd mention that first. But going back to Voltaire, I first read Voltaire at King's University in Halifax doing the FIP foundation year there. And I was very, you know, interested in philosophy at the time, and literature and reading. And I had just spent a year in Nepal and India working as a volunteer teacher. It was my first ever teaching experience. And when I came back from that experience, I was, I guess, a little lost, but also just, experiencing some culture shock from having spent a year there and then coming back as sort of a youth at 19, 20, and then getting back to university and getting into sort of this privileged space maybe at university that seemed a little bit foreign after kind of this profound experience that I'd had working in Kathmandu. But so I read Candide during that year, and it really sat with me. And it's a book that's really returned for me over and over through my my own learning, and as well, it's returned into my teaching. As I started to teach IB, the curriculum sort of dictates that we read two authentic French pieces. And so I was, very inspired by this work. And I said, okay, well, great, I get to do this. And I did it in French and read this a few years running with my students. One of the reasons why I really enjoy Candide as a read is that it speaks to a lot of some of the themes that we've been thinking or talking through over the last few days, but definitely observation, expansion of awareness, critical dialogue with the self, centering the self, and sort of observing social injustice. So if you don't know the work, Candide is sort of this naive young man who starts, from a very privileged sort of background and embarks on sort of adventure, not because he kind of wants to, but because this event occurs and it sort of explodes in war. I mean, it was written in 1759, so you can imagine the context there. And he travels around with his teacher, Pangloss, who is constantly affirming that all is well in the world. And Candide starts off very naive, and yet through inquiry and experience, he becomes increasingly more and more aware of suffering in the world and social injustice. And I don't want to be spoiling the end of the book here, but eventually he meets a Turkish farmer who teaches him that happiness is to cultivate your own garden. And I started with that quote, il faut cultiver notre jardin. Just an interesting use of pronoun there, because he says we have to cultivate our own garden, which could be, he didn't say my garden or his or her garden, he said our garden. I find that particularly interesting. And so this Turkish farmer sort of explains to him that really what's important in life and how to find true happiness is really through cultivating your own garden. And while this is a very Eurocentric French text, I think it does kind of speak to some of the key themes of meditative inquiry, as we've seen, speaking around awareness, lived experience, subjectivity, reflexivity, observation, and the development of your consciousness and awareness. So I'll just note here that while this text was an amazing read and I loved it so much, I realized the last time I read it that after I'd finished the book, I closed the last page and I looked around my class and I was looking at like a lot of really blank stares. And I realized in that moment that maybe I was reading it a little bit for myself instead of reading it for the students, or really, that they just didn't seem quite as engaged as I did in this text. So that was sort of my own process of looking at my own practice and how I could be more meditative and reflective on that. Now I try and pay a little bit more closely attuned to student interest, let's say, with a piece of reading that you're going to do in class, but then also accessibility. And specifically for language acquisition, it seems like a very important fit. You can push them to do something more difficult, but at the end of the day, you don't want to lose all of them. And you also want them to be sort of engaged in what you're reading. So I just going back to what David Sable said here about letting go of some of those conventioned expectations, I sort of had to sort of let that go a little bit and shape up what I was doing. And now I'm, doing pieces that are a little different too, and trying to incorporate some different culturally relevant work. The second sort of story that I have here of just drawing on how I've seen meditative inquiry play out for me as a teacher in the classroom. is a different story altogether. And this isn't necessarily a look at like how students are engaging with meditative inquiry so much as the way I myself am engaging with it. So in this sort of second story or meditation that I have of how I was looking at meditative inquiry in the classroom, just to paint a picture, I have had this high level kind of group of grade 12 students, and they were doing an IB course, and it's a language acquisition course. And one of our units is called Partage de la Planète. So how do you share the planet? So, you know, I was very interested in all this work. I like to think of myself as an environmentalist. And I was, you know, we were looking at the ecosystems, and I was using texts from the IB documents and following the curriculum there. And they have very good themes, well thought out themes that are very contemporary. So in a way, I really enjoy that curriculum. But we were doing a lot of sort of literacy-based reading, for example, around ecosystems, the climate change, all
It's
those
3 minutes, Sally.
Thank you. And I'm almost finished too, so that's perfect. All very important things. But I looked around and what I perceived about just the emotion in the classroom, to talk about sort of that emotion of the body, a lot of the students were a little bit bored, which was interesting because they were pretty engaged students. I even had an environmental activist in the class locally here. So I started thinking about how that was, you know, how they were internalizing it. And to my mind, I think it was bringing up a lot of eco anxiety. And I just mentioned that because for me, it's not that it was necessarily an aha moment, but I decided at that point to sort of change my approach. And, you know, it's just a simple thing, but I had them sort of, I revamped that part of the unit, and then I just had them build their own green businesses. We put all their ideas into a shared collective Google Slides, and then students were speaking around sort of what they had created and these green local businesses that they had basically created. It was such a creative process, and I think it was just a really small change. I changed my approach, and I just add in closing that I think I kind of went from something static to just trying to create something a bit more imaginative. And I really did feel like the students responded to that, and we had really good dialogue come out of that. So I think I'll just let that sit there, but I'll close with another French philosopher, a little French quote here that I found. Her name's Simone Weil, and she said, "L'attention est la forme la plus rare et la plus pure de la générosité." And I think it just kind of returns to what we've been talking about, Krishnamurti and his influence also on this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ali.
Thank you.
Okay, Dawn, I'm going to, can I ask you to turn your camera on for a moment so I can spotlight you, Dawn?
Yeah, is it on now?
Yes, it is. Perfect.
Awesome.
Okay. And I'll also give you 12 minutes and a 3-minute warning.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, and you can start any.
Okay, so hi, I'm Dawn Erley, and I'm a new English and social studies teacher in Halifax. And I'm beyond honored to be able to speak at this conference and hear all of your wonderful insights. It's really cool to be here. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, Ontario at the moment, which is the traditional land of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And the dish with one spoon is an important treaty to recognize as a settler in the Great Lakes region. This is where I'm from. So we all eat from the dish, and we now share this territory with only one spoon. Thus, we have an obligation to ensure that the dish is never empty by taking care of and advocating for the land and all the beings that are part of it. So I have to admit that I find meditative inquiry to be a really hard art to comprehend and explain. For, as Ashwani Kumar states in the intro of this text, it's really expansive in its scope, and it covers a range of questions and themes. But his examination of meditative inquiry against meditation and mindfulness practices really helps me understand it. So as he explains, the goal of meditative inquiry is not to meet the expectations of capitalist culture and its focus on productivity and performance. Rather, by awakening our awareness and intelligence, meditative inquiry enables us to engage with internal and external conflicts and challenges profoundly and holistically. It implies meeting life with a sense of deep and existential awareness, an awareness that is rooted in freedom, creativity, and dialogue. That's kind of a big chunk. So I went through kind of how I interpreted that and based my presentation sort of around that. So I interpreted that quote as, first, meditative inquiry is about developing this deep and existential awareness of the dimensions of life. Second, becoming aware allows us to engage with the challenges that we face in a genuine way. And third, the aim of this awareness is freedom, creativity, and dialogue. So as a new teacher, this is kind of like the meaning that I contend with, how to help students discover and develop this awareness so that they can live authentically and discover their own truths. And at a basic level, I think that's about encouraging curiosity. Something really important that I learned while taking a course with Ashwani came through a guest that he invited to speak with us, Elizabeth Cremo, the Director of Education for the Escazone School Board. And what she said that really stuck with me is that in their concept of education, they acknowledge that students aren't going to take the same meaning from a given lesson. And that really clicked with me, because if you have, let's say, 30 unique students in your classroom, all with completely different backgrounds, how could they possibly learn exactly the same thing from any given lesson? It's really simple when you think about it. I conceive of it as like two people watching the same event go down. Each person's likely to remember what happened slightly differently, remember certain details more vividly due to their identity and their interests and so on. So if we're expecting students to neatly fit within our confines as educators and the system's expectations, we're doing a disservice to who they are, and we're taking away their ability to be curious, to make meaning from their learning, their own meaning, or even intrinsically enjoy what they're doing. So how can we encourage this curiosity through meditative inquiry? I think that one way this can be done is by, at a simple level, just encouraging students to explore the things that they wonder about themselves, others, and the world. I think in a classroom that prioritizes meditative inquiry and dialogue, the topics that can be covered should be co-constructed and collaborative rather than prescribed. I think just asking students what puzzles them, what perplexes them, what captures their attention has really broad applicability in English. Beyond informing the kind of material that could be explored, their wonderings could be used to facilitate open conversations about many different topics without a fixed goal. So setting aside time for this kind of dialogue would let students acknowledge thoughts and feelings that they're experiencing, while perhaps also showing them that they're not alone in their fears, their anxieties, and their joys. So while an exercise like this would highlight and strengthen the relationships in the room and give students this opportunity to kind of trade insights and share in knowledge construction, it's also the kind of activity that would let them walk away with their own meanings. But for students who aren't as connected to their curiosity or who don't know what they wonder about, I think that experiential learning could be a good way to raise questions in their minds. For example, in the English classroom, the students could explore a text written by a local author by traveling to its setting or a comparable location. Just while they're there, they might, consider where the artist's curiosity comes from and how they get inspired. They might be inspired by the location themselves, and so on. In texts less grounded in reality, they could create art pieces to imagine what the setting might look and feel like. But in either case, a more embodied type of learning is taking place, and this could give rise to all kinds of wonderings. While recognizing the importance of encouraging curiosity when it comes to my teaching practice, I also think about the dialogue that's happening between the past and present in the English classroom, kind of like what Ali was mentioning. In the English classroom, it's important to recognize and challenge, as Ashwani describes, this colonial and capitalistic control of the nature of knowledge and processes of exploration and understanding, as these forces have marginalized non-Eurocentric ways of being and knowing. As I was taught by my former professor, Nima Nagibi, quoting the work of Gauri Viswanathan, the first English literature department ever was created in India. Understanding that there was a rich literary tradition in India, the British created English literature as a field of study for the purposes of socio-political control and the destruction of local cultures. English literary studies have been imposed on peoples around the world by colonial nations, including in Canada, with the residential school system being a prime example of this use of English as a colonizing force and an instrument of control, with students being forbidden from speaking their languages and forced to learn English or French. So considering how English has been imposed and enforced on individuals globally, how can English teachers reconcile with that and move towards a decolonized English classroom? And what role could meditative inquiry play in this? In my own educational experience, the formal academic essay was upheld as the standard of good writing in the ELA classroom, and whether it was, implicit or explicit, it was elevated over other informal types of writing to the point where even creative pieces were expected to be kind of structured according to the conventions of these formal types of writing. So while we can't avoid the essay, we can demote its status in the classroom and explore the context and functions of specific types of writing. English teachers can give creative and personal writing the spotlight, as these forms more freely allow students to play with structure, punctuation, spelling. They can incorporate slang, non-English words, dialects, etc., to find their own voices and genuine outlets of expression. And in a similar vein, teachers can encourage code meshing in academic essay writing. With code switching, we're teaching students how to translate their Englishes into the standard academic language. But by contrast, as explained by Jay Hardy, code meshing pedagogies encourage students to pull together all of their rhetorical resources. So it not only makes for engaging writing, but it also honors the identity of the writer. So
just 3-minute warning, okay?
Thank you. All in all of these ideas may hopefully inspire curiosity, intrinsic motivation, and address kind of the colonial imperial influence that's happening in the ELA classroom. And again, I just wanted to thank Ashwani for having me, and thankful to all of you for being here and being able to listen to all of your amazing ideas.
Well, thank you so much. That was perfectly timed, but I really appreciate your words, Dawn. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and now the next person that's up is Carolyn Prest. And
hi
I
there.
can just do that. And it's over to you. Again, I'll give you a 3-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Again, just let me know if things start to cut out, because I'll turn the screens off. It's just,
Okay.
I'm a little worried about the weather and the connectivity.
Okay, so far so good, but I definitely will.
Okay, thank you. I sit at the ocean and I think, not think. I watch the space around me, and it provides me with a connection to something greater than myself, my fears, and allows me the space that I need to think, meditate, and reflect. I sit in the evening as the sky and the sea become pink, and although there's flat calm in the water and the air is still, I hear the roar of the steady crash of waves as they break against the outside islands kilometers away. I sit in the forest in late fall and see how everything changes and changes constantly, but to my eyes stays the same. And the cold, straight trees creak in the wind, bending but not breaking. Rainy summer days reveal the many shades and variations encompassed in the word green. I acknowledge that I'm in the unceded ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq people. In nature is where I practice my most meaningful meditative inquiry. Here, my greatest learning occurs through the act of simply being present. Sometimes it occurs naturally in the moment, and sometimes not until I've reflected much later. Observation of the natural world first gives my mind space to clear, and then to observe myself and my emotions. Nature teaches me what I need to know. I learn lessons based on my experience that relate to my biggest thoughts, fears, and struggles. I find myself in the natural world. My teaching career has taken place in various schools in rural Nova Scotia. I trained as an elementary teacher, but it quickly became apparent that I would need to be flexible in order to meet rural teaching demands. Through substitute teaching, I became comfortable with older students and I was exposed to the similarities and differences between subjects and schools. My first term positions were at the elementary level, but by the time I became permanent, I was teaching math at the junior high level. I've since become certified to teach visual arts at all levels, and I'm currently teaching a mixture of junior high and senior high courses, from math to the humanities to textile arts. It's not uncommon for teachers at my primary to 12 school of fewer than 300 to have such a course load. And those of us who teach secondary often find ourselves providing regular support in the elementary classrooms. Because of this, teachers are developing a sense of the demands at various levels, but more importantly, we're getting to know our students when they're young, and we're able to watch them move through the school as they grow. We're finding that we have the ability to plan and program for students over a long period of time. This aspect of our school holds great potential, especially when considering the impact of practicing meditative inquiry across grade levels and helping students engage in meditative inquiry over the long term. Similar to my relationship with it, nature is a cornerstone for many people in rural communities. There are individuals who have generational connections to the land, and we take pride in our relationship and our interaction with nature. We consider ourselves stewards and protectors and value what we have in the natural world. For this presentation, this is my lens. I look at meditative inquiry from a perspective where it can be introduced and practiced across grade levels, and where our connection to the land and our environment can be used to facilitate meditative inquiry and dialogue with our students. First, I'll consider how I can utilize our reverence for the natural world as a means to developing meditative inquiry into a regular component of our educational journey. Next, I'm going to discuss how meditative inquiry shaped my own journey as a teacher and some of the challenges I've faced when I'm promoting a more holistic approach to education. Additionally, if I don't run out of time, I'm going to discuss how the meditative inquiry collection has been positioned as a foundation from which to build my own meditative practice in my classroom and to promote it among my colleagues at all grade levels, and how the collection applies to all of us as practitioners interested in a holistic journey. As Ashwani mentions in his introduction, meditative inquiry has no narrow method, no set approach, but it's creative, holistic, and centered around the individual. This makes it applicable in many educational settings, given that you know your students and you've established mutual trust. In rural communities where services and opportunities struggle to meet the needs of the population, meditative inquiry is even more significant because there are few set requirements, no materials, and from students, all we need to ask for is trust. That being said, one must establish a deep connection with their students, which can sometimes be the greatest challenge of all. My hope has been to use meditative inquiry in my classroom to help my students cultivate their self-awareness through a medium that's safe, familiar, and respected. I allow them plenty of access to nature where they can explore, observe, and eventually become still. We work together to find space where they can create distance from their concerns and worries, where they can be comfortable to simply be. I want to be able to provide them with space for thinking and being without traditional academic and social expectations. Making observations, either personally or communally, is usually a good place to begin to move students away from external influences and the self. When they've grown accustomed to making this kind of space for themselves, we can begin to explore the external and then the internal. I provide time for my students to become comfortable becoming still while observing the natural world. For anyone, achieving stillness alone can be an accomplishment. Because of their general comfort and appreciation for nature, the environment's a safe space to explore discomfort as it arises. Once secure, I can begin to gently guide my students inward with simple questioning. I allow them the comfort of the space that they've achieved as I ask them to begin to contemplate various topics, such as consider the last time you felt proud or what worries you. Oftentimes, students will keep their thoughts personal at the outset, and I slowly begin to incorporate writing and then collaboration and dialogue. As comfort grows, they too can take lessons from the eternal wind, the tiny insects, and the steadfast timber. There's endless lessons to be learned about yourself and the world from these kinds of observations, and for every individual, the lesson's personal. With this practice, I feel I can begin to find some agreement between the friction of the traditional academic expectations and learning as I see it, and as Ashwani describes in his introduction to the collection. Education no more remains a problem of information transmission or means-end learning. On the contrary, it emerges as a space of freedom where the main focus is to learn about oneself and one's relationships with people, nature, and ideas. I too feel that it's imperative that we know ourselves, and until then, traditional schooling is too often, mere information transmission without a great deal of meaningfulness for the individual. While the affirmation that I can utilize the natural world to build meditative inquiry and holistic education in my practice has been critical in reading this collection, I want to recognize that meditative inquiry is intensely personal and situational. Where I found a way to the spirit of meditative inquiry for myself personally and professionally, using mine and my community's connection to nature, there's no one-size-fits-all methodology. Sean Bullock's path was through the martial arts. Susan Walsh finds connection through crafting beautiful poetry. For me, one of the most important learnings from the collection was that we must bravely seek our own path to a lifestyle or practice rooted in self-reflection and understanding. It's helped me recognize and name my own fears and struggles as they apply to my professional practice, and has in turn provided me with support to overcome the challenges that I encounter when I'm applying holistic and meditative principles in my class. Each contributor, including those who have offered the responses to the collection, have situated themselves as pillars that now support me in offering the best of myself to my students every day. As I made my way through the collection, I reflected on how I apply meditative inquiry in my own practice and my experience in doing so. Michael Cosgrove and Shannon Power, in their conversation on meditative inquiry and its impact on their teaching, spoke to me in terms of my fears and struggles as an educator, trying to balance the demands of a public system and my personal understanding of how to guide my students through their educational journey.
The 3-minute warning.
Okay, thank you. Like Cosgrove and Power, I feel that we must look at education as a way to bring about change to our world, starting with the individual, by helping our students understand how and why they think. I agree that we must move away from comparison of one against another, of measurement as an indicator of success, because this only builds on the conflict that arises within the individual. Cosgrove and Power refer back to Kumar and Downey when they state, learning does not happen when one's externally motivated. If students are pressured into learning, and if they're measured with grades, it keeps them from understanding their creativity. I believe I'm gonna scroll down a little here. I want to emphasize the importance of each contributor as well as Ashwani for facilitating this collection. Every contributor to this work has served as a pillar on which I enter into a new school year, more aware of my own fears as well as my beliefs. While these were not unrecognized before I began to read the collection, I no longer fear to acknowledge them because I know that I'm not alone and that there are others who see meditative inquiry to be as integral to education as I do. With the support of those that have shared their wisdom, I've been given the language with which to promote and support meditative inquiry in my setting without fear of scrutiny. I'm grateful to have had the opportunity to participate in this conference. In September will mark a new chapter for me in terms of my approach to teaching, and I will not go in with fear. As Anne Fallon describes, meditative inquiry is alive in the community of scholar practitioners represented in the collection, each of whom is committed to creatively developing, deepening, and extending it further. I too am committed to developing, deepening, and extending it further, and join this supportive, varied, and experienced community wholeheartedly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Okay, next up is Yelena. And there's Yelena.
Hello,
going
everyone. Can you see me? Can you hear me all right?
There we go. Okay, yes. Here you are.
Thank you very much for having me here, Dr. Kumar. And thank you to all of my colleagues and all this scholastic thought that I've been enriched with listening to you folks for the last 2 days. And since I joined the panel a little bit later, I was thinking for a long time, what is it that I can do with the meditative inquiry in an authentic way with my own students in the history classroom? And so what I've decided to talk to you folks today about is not actually about the synergy between the Indigenous and holistic educations and worldviews, but more so about the transformative energy of the meditative inquiry and how exactly it can actually enhance teachers' and students' well-being in our respective classrooms, and how by changing this well-being, we can look into conceiving a new perspective. That's what I live with. This is what I work with in a history classroom per se. So, and what I do the best is, I guess, telling stories to my students. So bear with me today. So marathon runners actually have a great term, to hit the wall. And in the wake of the pivotal events of 2020, after 25 years of teaching, I actually hit my own professional wall. What I have discovered is that my mind felt like a concrete post. And every online day of teaching felt like I would say a triumph of will. And I seriously doubted that the race had a finish line. And at that time, my students needed a better teacher, a more inspirational teacher, the one that was less fatigued. And so to get rejuvenated, I've decided to go back to school. Basically, I found myself in the intersection of apprehension and trepidation, spending many sleepless nights considering the soundness of my decision and whether or not I could actually handle both, being in an online setting, teaching and going back to school. So fast forward, this decision has proven to be a good one for me. And as I continued with my master's this year, summer school, come July, you can only imagine how burnt out the teachers are at the end of the school year. So once again, I lived my own conflicts of consciousness, and coming into July, I felt apprehensive how exactly I will feel and what is it that I'm going to do with this holistic education class. I had absolutely no idea what I was getting myself involved into. And so when I took Dr. Kumar's class, what I started feeling gradually as a day, it's an intense July course, as I started basically feeling from a day to day is that my consciousness was stirred and my mind that felt like a concrete post started feeling more, my spirit was awoken. And what I started feeling is that my put on hold passion, my inspiration, all of this started to come back. The creativity, somehow I started finding it within myself. So what I refer, and I spoke to Dr. Kumar about it, and basically I've mentioned to him as the illustrations to his book that I am starting to feel this partial cognitive metamorphosis. And in fact, all of us, 16 participants in that class, all educators, all burnt out, all tired. We all started feeling that the way the course has been hinged on through this esoteric ways of taking meditative walks in Hemlock Ravines Park, writing meditative journals, getting involved into dialoguing, conversations, it started to change us and we started evolving, and not only evolving internally, but we started coming back, we started restoring almost our educational pedagogical passion, and we started seeing that new vision of why is it that we teach. So bottom line, we felt like we were on this magical path of wholeness, not only to ourselves, but to the spiritual heartiness of teaching. And if I were to assume that educators are the central elements of their classrooms and their personal approach creates the climate where they instrumentalize their students' inspiration, engagement, and wholeness, then hypothetically, teachers' well-being should be proportionally should be proportional and congruent with their students' well-being. So in the disruptive era of COVID, most certainly we've seen how much the teachers had already been stressed, but the layer of COVID most certainly has impacted their well-being. And many of us have hit those professional walls. So we almost need this passion, we need the inspiration, we need the fire, to reignite and restore our whys of teaching. And to restore the whys of teaching, we really need the time and space. And when I say time and space, I don't necessarily just mean the time to plan. We need the time, the headspace, so we can heal from this chronic professional stress in general. And so what I'd like to show you is a specific example of what happened to me in Dr. Ashwani Kumar's class. So we were all engaged into the meditative writing that Monday morning. And as an educator, I actually made a comment. Right now, we are starting to have our September dreams about going back to school. And every Monday, we feel anxious about this uncertainty about what is it that the week is going to bring to us. And so the meditative writing exercise on Monday morning basically took my stream of consciousness to the current volatile Russia-Ukraine situation, because I basically allowed my thoughts to percolate freely. And contemplating about the war typically aggravates my Achilles heel and becomes the culprit of countless internal conflicts and chasms, because typically, as I hear about the conflict, being born in Russia or in the Soviet Union, basically, I see myself as a caveat of problems. And the reason why is likely because of the Hollywoodization of the propaganda machine. But that day, during that meditative writing exercise class, using that power of silence and using that headspace, I basically also applied something absolutely random that came into my mind, a paradigm, and what I call in my Soviet-born brain, an epistemology of nesting dolls. And so between the two, the holistic education, that stream of consciousness that took me on a path of unknown, and the order that I typically learn in through the system of those boxes of the nesting dolls, brought some peace and congruency and harmony, and I almost reached that cathartic moment. So at the time, I allowed my thoughts, as I said, to percolate freely, and I wrote about the Putin's events and local art fundraising event for Ukraine relief and the dilemmas I navigated through while supporting a Ukrainian refugee family that weekend. That was definitely a clear set of events. I had no idea why, however, the events in my notebook have been arranged in these very boxes. It's only later I realized that the analogy of the Russian nesting dolls came into mind, since the nesting dolls consist of an endless series of wooden figures, all resembling each other or sharing a common theme. So all
This is a 3-minute warning.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm already speaking too much. So anyhow, the idea is that I've managed to perceive myself through the system of these boxes. Instead of thinking outside the box, I've managed to look inside of this box and see myself for who I was. I found the courage to define my roots, myself, and who I was at that moment. We teach who we are. And at that moment, I had a courage to reconnect with who I was. And now I feel more empowered to go back to my students and seeing my own well-being. I believe that I will be a better educator and I will be better to serve my own students. So it's really important to reconnect with who you are. And sometimes not necessarily to think outside the box, but have the courage to look inside of that box and create peace and order within yourself. And I believe this is what a lot of us as educators, we need, that peace of mind, time, and space. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. Marvelous. Thinking inside the box. Okay. Thank you so much, Yelena. And there's one speaker left for this session. It's Jack Ward. And I'm just changed the spotlight over. So again, I'll give you a 3-minute warning, Jack, and it's over to you.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm going to share my screen here. So nice to see everyone. Yelena, it's nice to see follow a bunch of other folks who are teachers in the area. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about practical applications to the high school English classroom. Thank you so much for inviting me here. I appreciate it, Dr. Kumar and everyone. Love the book and everybody's work in it. Wanted to talk quickly about some of the problems that I came across as I thought about how to do holistic education, meditative inquiry within it. So things like, how do you apply the principles of meditative inquiry to a rigid structure such as a public high school framework? And how do you create assessments that are both open and equally applied between students? How do you identify scaffolding for students to have skills to move towards critical expectations like provincial exams and preparations for higher learning? And how do you manage administrative and parental concerns with that student learning? So I found there's this massive, and this is before I even took the course, but there's this massive tug of war between on one level, the administration wants you to do individualized learning for all your students. And then on the other level, it's like, well, why aren't you teaching the exact same content as the teacher next door? So if you're teaching grade 10, they expect all grade 10 English teachers to be teaching the same thing. And so it becomes a real problem to be able to solve something like that. So I went back to the typical outcomes, and I thought, you know what? The outcomes are flexible when it comes to English, arts, and language. So those flexibility can really help you, and they're designed to towards a mastery of skills between the grades. So if you can go back to the outcomes and utilize those as ways of being able to provide for your administration the opportunity to be able to use meditative inquiry, then you're ahead of the ball game. But you got to get buy-in from them in the first place, of course, and that includes your department head and those folks, lovely folks in the office. So I have, and some of you are familiar with it, I just have some quick examples of, this was from grade 10. So I just pulled a couple of sort of random outcomes, and you can read them on your own, as I just sort of mentioned that in English, for those who don't know, in the high school tradition, we have 3 segments, and one is speaking and listening, and that's what you're seeing in front of you. The next is reading and viewing, and there's interesting elements where you can do things like make thematic connections among stuff and read a wide variety of texts that include, print and other things as well. So visual and media. I love how they use the term CD-ROM. I don't think I've heard CD-ROM in at least 10 years, but it's nice that it's there. And the final segment that we have is writing and representing. And so I know in the past, I have kind of sort of dismissed representing, but after the inquiry and the holistic education, I put it as a real value to be able to understand that students get their learning through various different means. And so how do I utilize that in my classroom has been a big question. And because I'm so, as a writer myself, I'm so engaged in writing as a way of representing knowledge and answers. So the big question that I come up with is like, what does a teacher need to teach, right? So instead of standing in front of the classroom and doing sort of stand and deliver teaching, which has been a part and parcel of my teaching, of course, many of us do that to a certain degree, and it's required and needed at times. But I thought, what's most important? And so one of the most important thing is really, if I'm going to look at the segments and manage the outcomes, then I have to get the students to understand what are the successful keys to speaking, and then they can fill in how they're going to be able to do that in which ways that they want. What are the identifying the tools to clear storytelling, and that deals with the reading and the visual side, viewing side of things. So if they understand elements of how to tell a good story, beginning, middle, and end, and all the various aspects, how they do it is up to them. Same thing with applying formal and informal styles to ideas in writing and representing. If I need them to understand how to write an essay, what they write that essay about, as long as they follow those rules, it will make it easier for them to get through university, as well as the provincial exams that come in grade 10 for our high school teacher, or high school students, I should say. So teaching skills that will help unlock and remove the roadblocks of communication are so much more important than being able to give them specific content in that way. So I asked myself, like, how involved am I going to get with my students in the classroom, as opposed to sort of being there and delivering all this information and in an entertaining way, as what I've often tried to do in the past. What if I got them to start with inquiry? What if I got them to be the one who started to involve themselves with that? And if they can't do that on their own specifically, then what if I suggest some references to help them get started in an area that they've told me that they're interested in? And if that's still not something that they can do, then do I have some sources to get them started? And if that's not something that they can do at that point, then can I provide them with some definition and examples to get them to start thinking? So it's sort of like, at what level of support does each of my students need within the classroom to get them to the point where I hopefully will move them towards doing the inquiry themselves by the end of the year, so that they're ready for that as the years go by. So then comes the aspect of transparency. And I was thinking that I need to be specifically transparent with my students. And that means having everything sort of front loaded, in the respect that I want them to understand my expectations are set up in units or segments, depending upon your course. And I can provide open-ended rubrics so that they can demonstrate what I need to know to make that, for them to be successful in my class. And I need to give them a clear timeline with milestones, so they need to know how long they have to be able to do this exploration on their own. I need to be able to have key definition sheets and resource links ready to prompt them if they're stuck. And so I can put that into a Google Classroom as needed. And I need to have this sort of progressively individualized. And what I mean by that is, if my students aren't ready to do full straight in meditative inquiry and just let them do this on their own, how am I going to be able to build them on to do this, especially like grade 9s and grade 10s, when they may not have had as much individualized growth in the same way? How do I build within them the structures, the inner strength to be able to do that? And so that's things I have to think about. I have to have consistent check-ins and conferences with the students. And the cool thing is that I notice is that the less I'm doing stand and delivering and talking to my students, as I'm doing to you guys right now, the more time I have to speak with them individually. And that is really, it builds better relationships. It lets me know exactly what I'm missing and what they can do to help. And we feel more like a partnership in their education, rather than delivering something and hoping they get it. So this is a very quick element here where I thought my first unit is in fiction for my grade 10s. And so what do I want them to understand about fiction? Plot, setting, character, point of view, foreshadowing, all that kind of stuff. But I want them to be able to identify how they're going to be able to demonstrate that. So it doesn't matter to me in the end if they take some prescribed short stories that I have, or they listen to audio drama. As an audio drama guy, that makes me really happy if they did that. If they took it from movies, or if video games, or other aspects, whatever method of absorbing the media, to be able to understand these elements and how to be able to demonstrate them is important. I realized
This is a 3-minute warning.
Thank you. I realized that I'm going to have to give them a sample test too, and just because I want them to be prepared for the grade 10 final provincial exam. But all through that, in all my classes, of course, I want them to journal their learning so that I can be able to look into it. So what they can't articulate with me in individual conferences, I'll be able to maybe get an idea on as they send in journal entries for me to look at. And of course, student discussions in both group and class will be required so that they can recognize I'm not alone and that we're all working together for this process. So very quickly, from the problems at the very beginning, the solutions in reverse order. How do you manage administrative and parental concerns with student learning? You use the outcomes to support meditative inquiry. You structure the class for individualized content. You have dialogues with the students, parents, and administration, and you let the adaptations come from the students as opposed to directing down from me. How do you identify scaffolding? You provide key concepts up front. You build their understanding in the rubric. You allow students to reach through their own inquiry to learn it and to share and explore through discussion. How do you create assessments that are both open and seen? Begin with backwards design in your assessments, provide a series of milestones, dialogue with them, find ways for students to demonstrate their way of learning to you, and understand the level of support that each student needs. And then finally, how do you apply the principles of meditative inquiry to a rigid structure? You break down what you have to do into units or segments, and to please the administration and parents, you provide ways of using consistency and mindfulness to enforce individualized meditative inquiry, and then just be prepared to change direction and be flexible as you need to. So I think that's pretty much all I have. I wanted to, some of those core principles is interesting that this is taken from the beginning of Dr. Kumar's thing. Some of those are yours to share with the students, and some of those are them to be able to integrate on their own originally. But it is a partnership. Thanks so much, everyone.
Perfect. Thank you so much indeed. Once Jack stops sharing, there you are. Now, can I get all the presenters to please turn on their cameras so that you can all be spotlighted? Perfect. And there's still Yelena.
I got her.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay, so I've just turned the chat on, so now all the viewers, all the participants that are viewing can start thinking of questions to ask the panelists. And meanwhile, perhaps, I don't know, I mean, you've all had a chance to hear each other's presentations now. Do you have any comments you'd like to share on each other's presentations or reflections that were stirred up that might generate some conversation between you? Because we'd all like to hear you talk about things. Oh, you're muted, Jack. Everyone should unmute themselves now too.
It was a terrible comment. I just said, I feel like part of the Brady Bunch looking at everybody here.
What
Thank you
happens
so
when a bunch
much.
of teachers get together? I'll just start maybe by saying I just related to everything you all said so much, and I think that's maybe the commonality of being sort of in our public school system. I just really related to each and every one of you and thought it was really interesting, whether it's like pushing the boundaries of our curriculum or you know, looking at specific pieces and how we can change and modify them, and drawing from like places of stillness and nature and trying to incorporate those reflexive kind of pieces. And then Yelena, like I just, so much of what you said really tapped into something super important there for me too. So it was great.
I also want to mention thank you all for actually bringing all these points forward, because pushing the boundaries of the curriculum is such an important task. And quite often we're so stuck in our own fears and our own insecurities that, because once again, we don't have enough of that time and space provided to us just to be who we are, right? And so it's remarkably important for us, especially at the beginning of the new school year, to feel this inspiration, to feel this fire that we can do it for 195 days.
Mm.
The timing's really nice.
Yeah, it's sorry, I just want to pick up on that idea of space. Like when you mentioned that, it just made me think of so many things, but just reflecting on a course I just did in July too. And then one of the teachers in our group, she was so burnt out, and I just felt so much compassion for her, because I just understood where she was so much. And it was so difficult for her to get through that course. But what you were speaking to, Yelena, just tapped that feeling so much for me. So definitely relate.
I have quite a long comment to share here, and I'm going to read it out loud so that everyone can appreciate it, and maybe you could contemplate your thoughts on it, because it'd be nice to hear from everybody on this. I offer this comment with kindness and humility and some discomfort. I'm wondering, for those who are teaching place-based education, whether or not there is also critical learning presented that discusses the histories of place and lands, or the presence of the first peoples. This is part of decolonizing environmental education, because if histories of these lands are not considered and taught, we're inadvertently perpetuating myths of terra nullius, which is a colonial myth that purports that these lands were empty, which seeks to legitimize settler colonialism and perpetuates colonial thought and settlement. Our teaching on place-based or environmental education can become an unconscious collusion with ongoing colonialism by excluding who were here for millennia. So I wonder if anybody has some thoughts to share there.
I can speak to that. I thank you for the comment, and I probably should have added this into my presentation, but I absolutely work really hard with we have an Indigenous support worker at our school, and I work really hard when I'm teaching place-based education to be sure that I'm incorporating as much decolonized kind of history as I can, and as often and consistently as I can, because I agree with you. We have to be really careful about how we approach our relationships with the land, and I never would want to get into a situation where I'm perpetuating kind of the more modern thought about our land that we're on. So yeah, I'm working very hard and learning all the time on how I can incorporate that kind of education into my teaching and my practice.
I would also like to make a comment, if that's okay, to add to what you're just mentioning right now, Carolyn. I believe that something in our system can consider a term called placefulness. And to me, that would be an intersection of a place and a personal individual identity, where a person can have that sacred sentient spot where they can find themselves and contemplate in peace, can become actually a very rewarding practice, instead of possibly even suspending someone, just to give them the time to consider, reflect upon their actions, wrongdoings, and finding possibilities of resolving, rather than being seen as an issue. I feel like this is something that can be taken not just, again, holistically, not just within the boundaries of our own rooms, but maybe outside with the administration. So I would like to see more of those sacred places somewhere in our buildings. I should say outside.
Would anyone else like to share their thoughts on that before we move on?
Can I just, this is just a question actually, maybe to the viewers as well, but I'm always looking for French texts that are Canadian, but even specifically that would have that Indigenous context would be fantastic. Acadian, Indigenous, Métis, something Canadian that's French, that's accessible to high school students. So if anybody has any suggestions there, I'll gladly take it.
Diane, maybe you can give them, if you are hearing me, Diane, you can give them Danielle Root's email contact, because I think she develops that kind of material, especially in the French School Board. Well, I have a question for you all, if you don't mind. responding. First of all, thank you so much for taking the time to accept my invitation and preparing your very thoughtful remarks. I'm sure it must have taken a lot of time, given your vacation is coming to a close and you are all preparing for your next term. So thank you for doing that. What challenges you have experienced or think that you will experience in future when you experiment with critical approaches and holistic approaches like meditative inquiry and other approaches that have inspired you? What challenges do you feel from administration, from students, from parents, from within your own self, larger social structure? Any thoughts you would like to share? I think audience might appreciate your response to these questions.
Yeah, I'll share if I might. I think Jack touched on something really important in his presentation with that sort of vulnerability piece with students, that if there's not that trust that was identified earlier, if there's not that closeness, and sometimes even if there is, just sort of dealing with maybe the insecurities or things that are plaguing them at that time in their life, whether it's middle school or high school, I think can be challenging to implementing these things. But I'm hoping that if I can kind of do that, look in my inner box and do that work with my own vulnerability and then model that vulnerability, that hopefully if we've built that relationship, that might help us work through it together.
I'll add something as well. And by the way, thank you. It was great hearing Michael's conversation as well. And I found myself nodding a lot because we're both teaching in the high school area too, for that reason. One of the greater challenges I found the last couple of years is COVID has held back the social development of so many of the students. And so they don't understand very much of the social interactions that can happen with people. There's miscommunications, misunderstandings. They don't get facial cues. There's a bunch of things that really can cause a lot of difficulties, and that's made it really hard to create those collaborative relationships with students. I've found just in the past 2 years, I'm stunned too at the immaturity of some of the students that have come into high school, things I've never seen before in 20 years as being a teacher. Like I had kids, I've said this before to other teachers, I had kids knocking on my door and running away, like just banging on the door and running away in the middle. Not my students, just down the hall, running down the way as if it was Halloween Nicky Nine Doors or something. Like, it's very strange. Anyway, those aspects are disconcerting. The concerns from administration, because very much administration just doesn't want to have problems. And depending upon the relationship you have with your administrators, they could just very easily just say, make it go away. You know what I mean? It doesn't matter what it is. And that's a problem too, because as educators, I know I can feel the energy and the love you guys have for the process and for teaching. It's hard to just have to sometimes let things go when it's really important for that student that you engage. And sometimes the most difficult things are the most learning processes. The stuff that you have the most difficulty with is the greatest learning. And I love that letter that Michael shared with us for that reason. I've had students come back to me. One guy went through 3 different continents and came back 2 years later and told me, "I'm sorry for being a dick to you, Mr. Ward." And I went, I don't even remember that, right? So I was just, but it was important to him, and that those things matter. So we all know that we want to matter, and hopefully we're making those right strides. I think we are with meditative inquiry. And thanks again.
Well, the biggest benefit, if I may, is that meditative inquiry opens the door of exploration of a self. And for a lot of students, it can be both beneficial. It's a juxtaposition of a benefit and obviously a hindrance. Some of them are already emotionally intelligent, as I had mentioned before, to be and discover and have the time to look inwards. But some of them are vilified of that time alone, to be alone with their thoughts, what's going on at that point. So authenticity is my biggest challenge. Similar to Ali, teaching IB students, reflection is an enormous piece of anything and everything they do in the program, and it basically becomes mechanic. And it's been discussed in previous sections that our meritocracy based and capital, the bank of credits, the capital that they continue to acquire, the fact that they're so mark driven, they want to score that reflection, trying to see what is it that I want to expect, what I expect from them, rather than what's going on inside and what is happening. And part of it is probably their age, and part of it is peer pressure, and part of it is just the uncertainty. We don't do well with uncertainty. And the beauty of the meditative inquiry is that subjectivity, that subjective framework that we actually don't teach. We prioritize math and sciences, and we don't spend too much time on humanities. We don't value the law of silence.
Can I just add there too? I think you're right in the sense sometimes I think students don't have that language yet, like younger students. And so I think challenging is sort of coaching them through those processes. And if you're speaking it, there's a different challenge than potentially writing it or potentially expressing it. So then there's all those different modes that play in there too. So I think for me, just that, and then I have the additional challenge of having the second language piece as well. And sometimes they can't even find their words to necessarily express that. So for me personally, I think that's what I find the most challenging. Not so much I find language arts has a lot of freedom and flexibility to it. So it's not as constricted that way, but I do find like getting students through those processes, I guess, would be my biggest challenge.
One thing we didn't mention, and I think it's really important to talk about, and in some ways, and it's hard to say this because we're using technology right now, but the cell phone can be an enemy to meditative inquiry, in the respect that it can be a very good tool to look up stuff, but it also is a way to escape internal understanding of who you are, right? And so you need silence, and kids aren't used to silence. How to solve that issue, I don't know yet, because again, that's dependent upon your administration, dependent upon your school things, but it's key to be able to just get it, to put it down and be comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Carolyn, do you want to share some thoughts as well?
In terms of challenges, I would say my biggest personal challenges have been more systemic than student-based. Part of what I was going to say and ran out of time, Adrian Downey, I believe, in his piece talked about the ideal teacher, and a good teacher's well organized, and they meet the curriculum outcomes, and they manage behavior in a certain way. And I just truly believe that each of us, we are each individual, and we can't conform to a set mold. And I really struggle when I'm expected to conform to a certain kind of teacher template or teaching template. That's probably where I find my biggest struggles.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think most teachers who wants to do something creative and spontaneous, they really struggle with that, for sure. Thank you. We have a little bit of more time, and anybody would like to share anything else because of the time limitation, they may not have been able to share in their presentation. Anything that comes to your mind that you would like to share? All right.
Oh, I've always got stuff I can talk about. That's my problem, right? So as the minority in a group of 5 here, maybe I can speak a little longer. But I think I would love if at the end of all of this, if there was some way we could still be able to come up with ideas and support stuff together as educators interested in meditative inquiry. I think collaborating would be a lovely thing to do. It's always great when we parachute in and we get this great course and all that kind of stuff, but it's the follow-up afterwards what I think is really valuable. And I think Dr. Kumar would probably agree with that, but that's how I feel.
I have not taken, like I tried to do something, as I think mentioned in one of the classes, but it just felt to me that there was a lot of excitement, but no follow-up. And then it's very difficult for me to do it, right? But if teachers can come together, that's a very wonderful thing. And then I would be really happy to contribute, and so many other people will be very happy to contribute as well. Somebody suggested in one of the classes we could create a Facebook page. I have been slow in that regard as well, but maybe we can think about it. Ellie, you and I can think about it and then connect with everybody else.
Can I also point out that,
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully you're all going to read all of the chat. And if you don't have time to do that now, I will point out that if you just hover over the 3 dots underneath of the chat, you'll see more, and you can say save chat. You can click that and it will all download and save for you. But I want to point out that there's a comment here, quite extensive one from Karen Jacobson, who actually was describing the kinship she's feeling toward you all, suggesting she's giving a link to her master's project on creating a space for contemplation, and also giving her email address. And so that's not to say that this Facebook page isn't a good idea. I'm just saying there is already here something that's a spark. And also, please do download the chat, because various people have made comments that we haven't read through. And I know what it's like when you're talking, you can't necessarily scan comments. So yeah, do that.
Thank you, Bonnie. That's very helpful. Yes, please have a look. And if you have anything that you would like to respond to anything, we still have a little bit of time. You could do that.
The community that I've kind of found around this presentation is I find it so supportive to furthering my practice with meditative inquiry in my classrooms. It's really beneficial for me, and it really helps when the days get long to know that, we do have a community here.
I think there is just a little bit of effort that is needed to pull people together. And as Bonnie said, there is a lot of sense of kinship. And I feel that probably teachers lack that kind of an organization where it's an open community group where people can come and just discuss their issues. So not necessarily union matters, but something personal and pedagogical that where it connects, and it can be really useful for teachers. I definitely think that there is a lot of research on it as well, that teachers who have strong knit communities, they do really well. They are able to sustain themselves through the thin and thick of teaching, or thick and thin. I don't know, one of the two.
Thick and thick is probably the most accurate, actually. Maybe it's always thick.
Thank you, Bonnie. Well, I think, Bonnie, it's quite late in the day. I don't want to keep them any longer. So I think
Yes.
we can thank them, stop the recording, and then talk about a little bit for tomorrow. But
Right,
thank you
okay.
again, Jack, Carolyn, Dawn, Ali, and Yelena, as you're appearing on my screen. Thank you so much for taking the time. And let's see if we can find a way to create some kind of a small scale community. And if anybody wants to join it, we could do that. I think it's possible to do that.
Yes. And don't forget to download the chat.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Take
Okay.
care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.